Well, after the strong run we've seen in many large cap stocks, our featured guest today says investors may want to have a look at similar mid cap stocks for diversification. Joining us now to discuss is Brian Dausch. He's a portfolio specialist with T. Rowe Price. And Brian, welcome to the show. This is your very first show on Money Talk Live.
Thank you very much for having me. We're looking forward to talking about our spaces.
All right, so Brian, you cover mid-cap stocks as well as the healthcare sector for T. Rowe Price. How have these asset classes performed compared to large-cap stocks, and what's driven that performance?
Unfortunately, the markets have really been driven by a small handful of companies, the Magnificent Seven, as they've so been called. That have really propelled the S&P 500, to do quite well relative to all of the asset classes, certainly within the U.S., and have also been really powerful kind of across the globe. And in many respects, we can sometimes go through these long, bull market cycles that sort of end in a period of high concentration in large cap growth stocks, and a lot of other asset classes are forgotten in the midst of that. And so mid caps, unfortunately have not performed as well as large caps driven by Mag 7, nor have healthcare stocks as well too. Yet, when you look at these asset classes, I think there's a lot to like, under the surface in terms of fundamentals. Of course, the market's been sort of fixated on the adoption of AI and the build out of data centers and all the ramifications of that. We'll probably get into that in a lot more detail later, but I think there's a lot going on in the case of mid-sized companies and healthcare companies in the U.S. that we think are also really compelling. So stay tuned for more on that.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot going on there. Now, for investors who already have some of the big names in the portfolio, what role can mid-cap stocks or healthcare typically play in a diversified portfolio?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with mid-cap stocks first, and then I'll talk about healthcare. Mid-caps as an asset class have been a really compelling area of the U.S. market to invest in over the course of the last 30 years. And some of that is driven by the fact that they are smaller companies than larger, more established, sort of blue chip types of stocks that ultimately mid-cap companies can, their earnings can grow faster than that of large companies, and they tend to have reasonable levels of volatility, certainly when compared to much smaller companies. And actually, if you look at the both performance and standard deviations of mid-cap stocks, they've outperformed large caps over the last 30 years with only a little bit more volatility and then a lot less volatility than what you see down cap in small caps. And a lot of that is because these companies are still, in the very maybe earlier innings of what could be a long multi-year growth type of story where they're compounding into something that becomes much larger, right? Like Amazon and Tesla and Microsoft and all of the darlings of today in the markets were once upon a time mid-cap companies that were growing at much faster rates than they are even as they get to be much larger companies. So mid-caps in the context of a broader portfolio we think makes a lot of sense because you can both get good returns at reasonable levels of risk, and it's diversifying right to the larger cap companies that may have a lot more multinational influence. And maybe just finally on healthcare, and then I'll pause for a moment. Thinking about healthcare stocks, they tend to be a little bit more defensive in nature, right? Like they're not particularly dependent on the economic cycle because there's demographic waves and people are consuming healthcare all the time. We get sick, we need treatments. It doesn't matter whether, we're in an economic boom or bust, so to speak. And so we'll maybe touch on healthcare and some of the drivers in more recent years coming up. But, I think healthcare has been a space that ultimately has delivered, pretty good and steady growth over time. And there's this big innovation wave that's really happening under the surface that I think is now starting to come out in healthcare that we think is really attractive as we look out over a multi-year basis.
Okay, so I want to focus on some of those drivers. So what are some of the recent developments or emerging trends in the mid-cap and healthcare sectors that could drive future performances? And why are these areas attracting more and more interest from investors at this point?
Yeah, so in the mid cap space, when you look at earnings growth, they've been consistently double digits, kind of over the last 30 years, and we think that continues today. Obviously, so much of the focus has been on AI and some of the more meme types of stocks and areas that, maybe revenues have grown pretty rapidly. Even just looking at the Bag Seven, right? The growth that those companies have been able to deliver has been quite high in recent years, 20% plus growth compounded. But we think there's a lot of actually pent-up growth to come in the mid cap space as well too. Even when you think of like using AI as an example, going back to the internet bubble, right? It wasn't the Cisco's and Intel's that really sort of delivered incredible compounded performance over multi-years, multi-decades. It was really Amazon and Netflix and companies like that, right? They figured out how to harness the power of the internet, and we actually think that the power of AI is going to largely be felt through software companies or companies in other sectors and industries that have more of a data-centric focus, even something as simple as pizza, Domino's Pizza, that's developed a really impressive mobile ordering platform, or Old Dominion in the trucking space that's utilized technology in a very different way. That could be actually big winners and improve their competitive advantage by the adoption of AI. So that would be an important theme, I'd say, is the broadening out of the big users of AI and how they might improve their competitive advantage in the mid cap space. And then in the healthcare space, which I think we'll talk about in a lot more detail a little bit later, there's been this big wave of innovation that really started back in the early 2000s with the sequencing of the human genome. And now finally, we've had the technology kind of catching up to that level of better understanding of human biology to where we're able to develop better drugs that are more efficacious, that have lower, safety issues, and ultimately are kind of changing the way that medicine's being practiced.
When we talk about some of these companies who are trying to achieve a competitive advantage, are there any particular trends or innovations like new medical technologies, for example, or faster growth companies that make mid-cap growth and healthcare companies sort of stand out from tech companies? And what should investors be watching for in these segments?
Yeah, when I think about like some of these advancements that are occurring, maybe I'll start with healthcare first. Um, there are areas that we just could not treat before in terms of diseases. And some of it was because maybe we didn't have the right diagnostics in place to allow us to see the formation of disease sooner. In other cases, we just simply couldn't attack a disease because we didn't have the specificity and the drugs that were being developed. So in the example of healthcare, which actually plays into midcap as well too, because healthcare is a large portion of the midcap space and our portfolio there too. There's actually pretty meaningful advancements in diagnostics. So there's examples of companies that are doing early cancer detection through a technology called minimal residual disease testing that actually can detect fragments of cancer tumors in the blood cells. And as you can imagine, being able to detect cancer maybe in stage one or even precancerous types of cells, the treatment outcomes are far better when you catch it earlier than, you have a lump and you go to the doctor and you say, hey, this isn't right. This has been growing pretty rapidly. And before you know it, you might be in a much more advanced stage of cancer that's more difficult. So, I think, early cancer detection and screening, there's a big innovation that's happening there. And then, I think in particular on the therapeutic side, there's lots of innovations that are occurring that are allowing us to go in and deliver, more precision-based medicines, whether it's knocking out a specific protein or whether it's actually developing drugs that are much more longer lasting, where you might take a dose of it that lasts you 6 months, instead of having to take 3 pills a day to kind of keep the right level of medicine in your body to hopefully have therapeutic effect.